Yo guys, how's it going? My name's Phil. I am a photojournalist, photographer, video editor, transit user, and city lover. Today, we're going to talk about Baltimore's Baltimore Link bus system. Like almost every city in the United States and Canada, Baltimore once had a top-of-the-line streetcar/trolley system, as well as pretty quick and comprehensive interurban rail services to places like Annapolis. In fact, there's not really a Baltimore Link bus system as we know it today without a lot of these old streetcar lines. From the turn of the 20th century to the mid-1930s, the United Railways and Electric Company was in charge of streetcar operation in Baltimore City and the counties. It's also credited with creating this Baltimore Skyline fixture. Before a giant electric guitar was mounted on it, this power plant provided electricity to this entire map of streetcar lines. At its peak, they boasted a 64-line network over every crevice of city thoroughfare. It and the city itself even powered through the Great Fire of 1904, which is considered to be one of the darkest moments in the history of Baltimore. After the Depression, United handed over operations to the Baltimore Transit Company, which was also privately owned despite its public entity-sounding name. The BTCO operated the entire network for 13 years, excluding the 17 routes that it turned into bus lines or eliminated completely, before selling to this video's first, and I would argue most premier villain, National City Lines. Now, I'm not here to give you a comprehensive history of National City Lines or ruin the ending of Who Framed Roger Rabbit for you.
Apology accepted. Put it there, pal.
I'm here to tell you that with financing from General Motors, Firestone Tire, Standard Oil, and Phillips Petroleum, National City Lines gobbled up Baltimore City's streetcar lines one by one, year after year, until the last one was put out of service in 1963.
I bought the red car so I could dismantle it.
See, this process eliminated every single streetcar line in the city and surrounding area, removing the overhead catenary and either replacing them with diesel-powered bus routes or just leaving the steel in the ground to decay with no service alternative except, you guessed it, driving. I give all this context because it's vital to understand that Baltimore's current car ownership culture, if you can even call it that, where 75% of households own, lease, or finance a car, isn't some private sector market force wave of innovation that was spurred from how awesome cars were and how cheap they were to fuel, maintain, build infrastructure for, etc. Because cars are insanely expensive to fuel, maintain, and build infrastructure for. And they're pretty awful at moving massive amounts of people in any given direction, even on the widest of highways. Because no matter how many lanes you have, you all still need to get off the highway, and ramps are never 4 lanes wide. Anyway, it's the way it is because corporations decided it would be, not because consumers did. All that said, 2 things can be and are true here. The way Baltimore streetcar lines were purchased, sunset, and dismantled was nefarious. And buses are much more flexible, cheaper to maintain, easier to operate, require far less infrastructure, and can handle far more variables doing much of the same job that streetcars did and do all across the world. The problem is when you don't view this as a public service and instead view it as a money-making scheme. Basically, how many routes can we have to just keep this thing going without having to sacrifice making a dollar? And what that means is without having to hire too many drivers and staff. Basically, not using the savings from going from streetcars to buses in a way that improves service for your new mode, but instead filling the ever-expanding fiscal hole most transit authorities without dedicated funding sources find themselves in. It's what's known as the transit death spiral, and I'm going to talk about that in future videos. To say buses are the workhorse of Baltimore's transit system would be the understatement of the year. They are basically the entire map. This is also true of most transit agencies in North America too. Buses just go everywhere because roads are everywhere and have a ton of cars on them, which, lest we forget, was not by accident. In fact, MDOT MTA buses moved more than 47 million riders in 2023. Now, you may ask, and justifiably so, how does a city with 600,000 people move 47 million a year just on buses? Well, it's kind of like mileage on a car, right? If you take the same route from one place to another every day for a year, that's say 10 miles round trip, you drive 3,650 miles, but you may have never left your city or your county. You didn't drive the one-way 3,500 or so mile distance, but your car did drive those miles. And importantly, each of those trips is counted individually. In terms of bus ridership, a person may get on the CityLink Red in Towson and go downtown for work 5 days a week with a return trip in the evening. This one person would therefore account for 520 annual quote-unquote riders, even though they're not actually 520 individual different people. Suffice it to say, even with all of that in mind, our system, for a system of its size, for a population of its size, moves a ton of people. More than Denver, more than Atlanta, more than Minneapolis, more than Dallas, and more than Phoenix, whose metro areas all have way more people than ours does. The current link system we have hails from former Governor Larry Hogan's canceling of the Red Line Light Rail project, because of course it does. Watch my video on that here if you haven't already. In an age-old political move that's happened in city after city in North America, Annapolis gave Baltimore City's bus lines a rebrand, a new logo, and an overhaul, instead of a new rail service, because why would they do that? This is a theme for the Maryland Transit Administration, and oddly enough, for Republican governors as well in the state of Maryland. Governor Bob Ehrlich tried to trot out the Greater Baltimore Bus Initiative, or GIBI program, in the early 2000s, which by all accounts went belly up by 2007, even though some changes were actually made to the system. But we're here talking about the Baltimore Link system, which makes the GIBI system the former system. And that former system, Frankensteined as it may have been,
it's pronounced Frankenstein,
had a bunch of lines that went to areas that supposedly had pretty low ridership but punched above its weight in other corridors of the city. Hogan's Link rebrand turned routes that initially just terminated downtown into routes that would run through downtown to other areas as a way to mimic a traditional metro system, akin to the radial map proposed in the 1960s rail plan, which you can watch my video on here about the Metro Subway Link. These radial-looking lines are called CityLink lines, and the numbered lines that either got carried over from the old system or renamed are more zigzaggy-looking local link routes. They're supposed to really service the nooks and crannies of every neighborhood, including arterial roads like Reisterstown or Liberty Heights. The city links are denoted by colors on the map we have currently, instead of like numbers like they were before, and the local link routes are just known by number instead of by letter and number, or sometimes just number, or sometimes single-digit number, but now they're not single-digit number, like they were on the old one. However, not all CityLink routes continue through downtown to other destinations. CityLink's red, brown, green, and purple run from suburbs in Baltimore County to downtown Baltimore City and then loop back. Unsurprisingly, the CityLink Red, which goes from Towson to downtown Baltimore City, is the most ridden CityLink route, the most ridden bus route, actually, in the city. And that's by about 200,000 riders. It's really not close. It makes a pretty straight shot down York Road and is almost always packed. Orange is the next busiest, followed by navy, blue, and gold. No, there's not a navy blue. There's a navy and a blue. There's also a lime and a green, but not a lime green. It's an interesting naming system, to say the least. Anyway, the thing all these high ridership lines have in common: connections to other modes.
Coincidence? I think not.
Basically, the MTA is good at what's referred to as last mile transit. Getting off the light rail in Lutherville, but you need to get to downtown Towson where the light rail doesn't actually run, CityLink Red's got you covered. Getting off the
Oh, hi, Mark.
in West Baltimore and need to get to shock trauma, CityLink Orange picks you up right at the train station and drops you off right in front of the emergency room. It really comes in handy, and a lot of these routes are straight shots, the CityLink ones at least, and they don't really zigzag the way that the local link routes do. Of course, there are always exceptions to that. For example, CityLink Purple runs along Frederick Road in southwest Baltimore, but instead of just following Frederick Road into downtown, it makes a detour into the Yale Heights neighborhood, comes back to Frederick Road, and then continues into downtown Baltimore City. The reason for this is that the old 46 and 10 routes that the CityLink Purple replaced did basically this same maneuver, outright canceling the 46 and the 10 instead of making the Purple quasi-express while keeping the 10 or 46 as a local route that could run just as frequently, means the route runs more like a local link than a CityLink. Basically, it adds like a 6 to 9 minute detour to a route that would ordinarily be a pretty straight shot into downtown Baltimore City, past a bunch of marquee destinations for people that live along the corridor. But the creme de la creme is the CityLink Yellow. In fact, of the CityLink routes that the MTA runs, the Yellow is by far the most local link looking one. First and foremost, it can terminate at several different locations, most notably the Patapsco Light Rail Station and the Lansdowne Station Shopping Center. And that's honestly not the most confusing part about the Yellow, because other lines do that. The Gold does it along North Ave and goes down to Canton Crossing sometimes, and the Silver will sometimes go to Morgan State or Hopkins. And if you ever find yourself confused by that, just look at the sign in the front of the bus. It'll just tell you where it's going to go. The confusing part is there's instances where the Yellow deviates pretty sharply from what would be a relatively straight shot to service neighborhoods in tucked away corners, just to double back and continue along its initial, more direct route. The first is this maneuver here, where instead of going straight down Madison to Utah, it makes a left and services a neighborhood just south of Druid Hill Park. It then doubles back along the same neighborhood street, makes a left on Madison, then continues on to Utah. It does this south of downtown too, by the Kaiser Medical Center and the Baltimore business community. Now, that's not to say those areas shouldn't be serviced at all or by these particular lines. It's just one of those things you notice when looking at the map that makes you kind of just scratch your head. To me, the more granular coverage should be the job of the local links, and the city links should operate more like express buses down major roadways or direct routes into downtown. Moving to the local link side of things, there's two different types of local link service. These white and gray lines that say they get 20 to 60 minute service, but sometimes more service during peak hours, but you really never know exactly when it's coming unless you have the transit app. And these darker gray ones that run every 15 minutes or better from morning till evening, not 24/7 like the city links do. That is an important distinction. But to be honest, the local links are pretty hit or miss, depending on where you live. The local link that goes by my place currently is complemented by a city link, which is great because it's very rare I see the local at all. Now, I did used to live in Highlandtown, and the 22 would definitely be an exception to the rule. It basically comes about as frequently as the blue or the orange city links, but as a caveat, the 22 is, by some stretch, the most ridden local link on the system. And honestly, it gets more ridership than like 3/4 of the city links. Like, it's insane. Because of all the twists and turns, you very often see local links doing what's called bunching. Essentially, this means a bus has encountered so many snags along its route that the bus that precedes it along the route is basically right behind it, often literally. This happens to the local links a lot because they make the most indirect routes. So they are at the most intersections and making the most turns that require yielding to other traffic the most. This can and does often result in angry commuters and riders, justifiably so, I would say, especially if your local link is one of those 20 to 60 minute service ones. Part of the local link family, though they're kind of their own category, is the express link service, the most popular of which, without a shadow of a doubt, is the 163. Why? Because not only does it use the Fort McHenry Tunnel to get around the twists and turns of city traffic, it services not just the hordes of people who work at the Port of Baltimore, but it acts as an express into downtown for people living in Dundalk, who'd probably rather not stop at every light along Eastern Avenue to get into downtown Baltimore City. Its connection to the West Baltimore train station is also a huge advantage. Now, here's the rub on the buses in Baltimore City and pretty much everywhere around the United States. The MTA, or whatever your local transit authority is, 9 times out of 10 doesn't own the road, or what transit nerds would call the right-of-way.
Your appearance is comical to me.
That is the jurisdiction of your city's Department of Transportation, and in Baltimore's case, the Baltimore City Department of Transportation. Luckily, part of the 2017 rollout of Baltimore Link was painting red bus lanes in downtown Baltimore City to facilitate faster travel times through congested areas for commuters, visitors, and anybody riding MTA buses. This one along Pratt Street's been here since 2009, but the Baltimore Link program not only increased visibility of the lanes by mandating they be painted red, it increased enforcement. What initially started as a somewhat rarely enforced fine for parking, idling, or driving in one of these lanes became a $250 fine a year later, but didn't get implemented properly, so the city lost about $500,000 in woulda, coulda, shoulda unforced fines. But bus lanes became really popular. So much so, the city received grant money in 2021 to double the size of their network. Annapolis also got involved by passing legislation in 2022 that put front-facing bus lane enforcement cameras on MTA buses to study the viability of more fines for drivers getting in the way. The results were viable enough to pass the House of Delegates in 2024, and despite being chopped up and sewn back together in the Senate,
Frankenstein!
it's now law, and cameras are now protecting our bus lanes from inconsiderate motorists, fines included. Despite that improvement, the biggest issue people tend to have with the buses in Baltimore City is the frequency and the reliability. Even with the bus lanes, threading that needle of making your bus transfer is a huge issue because of bunching, traffic congestion, stop spacing, and other variables that are really of no fault of any individual rider. The way to combat that is by running more buses, employing more drivers, and painting and enforcing more bus lanes. This helps with what transit nerds call on-time performance.
I'm a nerd.
Before Baltimore Link, the OTP for the MTA buses was just under 60%. That meant that you had basically a 50-50 chance your bus wouldn't even show up as advertised. After Baltimore Link, it peaked at nearly 80% in February of 2020 and has sort of plateaued at around 75% today. So what needs to be done to get that back up and past that 80% peak? One of the answers is actually right above your head. Transit Signal Priority is a solution that mounts a GPS device to individual buses that can tell traffic signals the bus is approaching the intersection. It then quickens the red light cycle or elongates the green light cycle. So not only can buses jump to the front of the traffic line in a bus lane, they can also get through the intersection quicker in the process. MTA actually got a federal grant to add TSP at 90 more intersections in Baltimore City too. So what about the drivers and operators? By all accounts, the Maryland Transit Administration only has about a 5% vacancy rate for its buses. But there's this term called employee per revenue vehicle, which basically measures how many drivers or operators are available per bus. Unfortunately for the MTA, their ratio is essentially 1-to-1. That means that when someone calls out, that's a bus that's just sitting at the depot, not going out, not picking up riders. So does that mean just hiring a bunch more drivers is key? Kind of. When a transit authority's ratio is as low as Baltimore's, you don't have much wiggle room. That means that when the MTA needs to run shuttle buses to compensate for the light rail's capacity constraints on Orioles and Ravens game days, that's one less bus driver on a city or local link route that could be making headways every 10 minutes instead of every 25. The same thing happens when the MTA closes down the subway link for the day or for the weekend to test signaling in new rail cars. They compensate with a bus service along the corridor, and you need drivers for that. So local link and city link routes lose drivers for the duration of that service disruption on a completely different mode. Basically, we have a transit system that relies almost entirely on our buses, our bus drivers, and our bus operators to do not just the workhorse stuff like you see in Philly, Chicago, or New York City, but everything.
So, I am on a date with this one. And we just experienced a real life example of what I was just talking about, because we tried to go up to Mount Vernon on the CityLink Silver, and it got canceled. And then the bus after that also got canceled. So we had to pivot because we were not going to wait an hour for the next one because she needs her pasta.
I need my pasta.
She needs her pasta. So we pivoted.
What I'm trying to say is a rising tide lifts all boats. The better our light rail is, the more reliable our buses can be. The better our subway is, the more reliable our buses can be. The better our commuter rail is, the more you get it. Essentially, if you want our bus system to be great, you can't just slap a GPS tracker on a traffic light and just assume that fixes everything, despite the fact that that's what every politician wants to hear. I mean, please do put more GPS readers on traffic lights, but for the love of God, do not stop there. If we want the workhorse of our city's mass transit to flourish, we need to value it and all it does. Thanks for watching. Appreciate you.